in general, as you're going around campaigning, looks like you're doing a lot of doors and events. What are you hearing from people as far as now, here today, going into the fall, what's the biggest issue on their minds?
Going into the general election, it is still about roads, education, and the economy. And I think the economy is still number one. We're starting to see some movement here in northern Michigan. Unemployment is down. People are making more money. Following the summer, albeit it was a little cool, talking to many of the retailers, the restaurants, the hotels, good infusion of downstate and out-of-state visitors. So we're seeing some good economic progress in terms of tourism, but also talking with a number of the cities. Traverse City, also here in Petoskey, some things going on in Boyne City, also in Sheboygan, a lot of new buildings going up. We're seeing increases in building permits being issued. Again, maybe not to the same level of the early 2000s or even the 90s, but a significant increase over the past, say, 6 years. And so that's a very good sign. So very excited about that. We're starting to also see some labor shortages. Not huge, but skilled tradespeople, carpenters, especially in the construction industry. So we're starting to feel that, and also even with some of the road projects and infrastructure projects here in northern Michigan, that they have to, they might be doing a road one day, sewer the next, and they're scrambling for workers. Those are jobs that are good paying jobs with benefits. You just can't hop in a dozer or a backhoe or something and be able to just work it. So there's that shortage too. We lost a lot of talent over that great recession that we had here in Michigan, and now we're starting to feel the effects of it.
Go back to the beginning of that. You mentioned roads. It might just help, all of us here. What's an update of the latest? What's happening?
The latest is still that we had the House package that dedicated nearly $500 million in existing revenues using efficiencies, warranty work, existing revenues dedicating some of the use tax and sales tax, the unallocated portions, also diesel parity. We included making sure that trucks were paying the same fuel tax that a car would pay, regular gas, and also overweight, oversized trucks, those type of permits. That package is still in the Senate. I don't see any movement before the general election, but there is talk in the Senate of again coming back in lame duck and proposing some new ideas. I continue to talk with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, both chambers, on what we can do. I remain optimistic that we need to get something done. But we felt confident in building and laying a good foundation with the House package of bills. The Senate, again, is going to try to improve or do something different. I wait to see what they put forward.
You guys have all said it, that you hear from constituents and they say this is the number one issue, get this fixed, and then we'll go from there. But yet time and again they're seeing it just discussion come and nothing gets solved, or no discussion at all, as we're seeing now.
Well, right now during September we're taking care of a lot of loose ends, but something major like an overall of how we fund or an increase in funding for transportation and infrastructure, that's something you just don't do in the next 2 weeks before an election, or next 6 weeks, I should say.
Will there be something in place, going into next spring that work can get done on some of these roads?
Well, we have put nearly $1 billion in the last 4 years, or 3.5 years, towards roads. We got nearly $35.5 million for northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula out of that $230 million in Risk and Roads Reserve Fund that we had here in Michigan, savings and unallocated money. So we've done well. We have orange cones up. We're making improvements. It was a tough season because of the weather. That put us behind. So again, coupled with some shortages of certain skilled trades, a shorter building season, and a backlog of much needed improvements and repairs, it made for a tough summer, but we've gotten some good projects done. And people are starting to see that. And what they're saying is, okay, you've done this, now we want to see more improvements.
And your package was, the package that came out of the House was about 500 million annually, is that right?
Roughly 500 billion, or excuse me, 500 billion, $500 million.
Okay.
And it really set the stage for, I think, improvements. We wanted to have people say, okay, you've put the money where you said you were going to put it, you've done increased efficiencies, the warranty work, and then we were going to say, okay, are you pleased? And then come back and say, what would you like us to do next?
What's the eventual solution, though? What do you see in that? Is there going to be increased gas tax? Is there going to be money taken from other areas of the budget? What's the?
Well, that's what people have always charged us with, to say use the existing revenues. So that's what we did in this first round. I think eventually we're going to have to look at a different funding model. It's very simple. We're paying approximately 19 cents a gallon fuel tax. Michigan, and I think you've been through it and you've done some good stories on it, and thank you for explaining it. Michigan has high taxes on fuel, but not actual high fuel taxes. And you can't say that enough. It's 18.7 cents a gallon, 19 cents. That's been the same since 1997. And we've seen cars get better mileage. We've seen people driving fewer miles. Partly because of the recession, partly because technological advances. People are carpooling, they've changed their driving habits for a number of reasons. I mean, I can look at my own family and how we carpool with other kids for school or put our kids on the bus. So those changes, both in terms of advances in technology in the automotive world, our driving habits, we're going to have to look at a different funding stream. And the fact that we have put off a lot of our infrastructure improvements. The old adage, pay me now or pay me later, it really does apply here. So eventually, we are going to have to do something to increase our spending on transportation, roads, bridges, and other forms of transportation. Let's not forget our ports, our airports, and rail, which are critical.
Well, and I think the chamber has, and other groups have indicated support for new revenues.
Mm-hmm.
You read various studies that are out there or public opinion polls, they seem to show majority support too for new revenues. Is that what you're saying? That's the eventual solution?
I think eventually we are going to have to look at new revenues. You could say, oh, it's an increase in tax or an increase in the registration fee. I think a key part of that, though, is first and making sure that people understand what they're getting currently and how it's paid for. And that's been a challenge sometimes. As I said, we have more efficiencies put into these bills that we've continued the last couple of years. Same thing with warranty work. Because a lot of times people say, oh, well, I just saw orange cones up yesterday and they put a skim of asphalt. Well, that's great. Maybe that lasts 3 years. And then 3 years from now, they'll go, well, you fixed it. Well, we didn't actually fix it. We smoothed it out for 3 years. So I think warranties, these efficiencies, come back to make sure that people understand that this is the best we're doing. We've said it time and time again. MDOT, the Michigan Department of Transportation, has half as many as employees as they did just 20 years ago. So they have half as many employees. Those state workers haven't had pensions since 1997. Mm-hmm. And these are the kind of efficiencies that we need to continue to tell the people, the voters, the constituents. We've already made these changes. So they're still under some misconceptions. And there were groups out there saying, well, we have the 5th highest gasoline taxes. Again, 19 cents a gallon, a lot of other taxes on there that go to other things. And when we look at changing those, you're talking $1 billion, $1.5 billion when you're talking education, local revenue sharing. And when you come back, they go, well, no, that's not what I mean. I just don't want that flag holder at a sign making, $50 an hour. Well, we've reviewed that too. They're not. Prevailing wage does not pay them $50 an hour to hold a sign, stop, go. But again, anecdotal stuff, the internet, 24-hour news cycle, all leads to those challenges.
Northern Michigan Chamber Alliance has also indicated support for an update to the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, and I saw that Democrats introduced a bill and been following that discussion. Why have Republicans been so slow to move on this? The governor's given his support to have the conversation. I realize that's what he's saying.
And that's where we're headed. We'll see if there are any Republicans that introduce legislation after the election in November. And at that point, you're going to have the conversation one way or another. I think it's sad that we have to legislate, that people do discriminate against people for a variety of reasons, and it's sad that we have to have this discussion. But when it does occur, that's the time we're going to look that I'm going to look at it.
Why do we have to wait till after the election?
Well, I think it's just based on the fact that we only have a couple of days left in September of session. So I think that the discussion will occur most likely after the election. Just that's the way it seems to be playing out right now. I don't set the agenda. I'm not the Speaker of the House nor the Democratic leader. So,
is it something you have liked to see? I mean, because we talked to Frank Foster, who was pushing this right after he lost, and he said, it's going to be the first thing that I do when we get back into session. And of course, he doesn't control.
Right, and as far as I know, he didn't put any legislation in. I think it was Representative Jeff Irwin and Senator Rebecca Warren.
Sure.
Who did it, and I quite frankly haven't read those bills.
Would you have liked to see the discussion happen here in September, though?
I was actually busy with transportation. I mean, the number one thing I hear from most people, besides the economy, is just fix my roads, get my street in better shape. That's what I've been focusing on.
Would you not, if you had the opportunity to vote before the election, vote for this change to the election?
I'd have to see what the proposed changes are. I mean, there's issues of the wording of preference versus orientation. There's a variety of things. There's the religious freedom, proposed legislation. I don't think there are any bluebacks. The draft legislation, we call them bluebacks, or bills to introduce. I haven't looked at any of those things, so I couldn't give you a yes or a no even if I wanted to, because I don't know what forms the bills are going to be in.
Is the religious component to that important to you?
Well, yes, there are some things that I think are very important. You certainly don't want to force businesses or individuals to do things that are against their religious beliefs. But by that same token, I don't want, I go back to it's frustrating that people would discriminate against someone. They should be judged on, especially in the workplace, the quality of their work, what they do. That's the measure that we should really be looking at, not some of the other things. But by that, again, I certainly don't want to put any religious group, whether it Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, in conflict with their religious beliefs too. So.
Okay, we can move on. Your opponent is running as an environmentalist, saying that he supports many environmental issues. There are certainly several of them going on up here. Let's take fracking as the first one. Is it properly regulated by the state?
Well, growing up here in northern Michigan, the environment, our natural resources, I've personally made my living off of people coming up north and enjoying the beauty. So it's very important to me too. When you start getting into the regulations, you look at our oil and gas regulations in the state of Michigan. The number of regulations, I think, is only second to California, which is kind of interesting because, sometimes many people think California is overregulated. But it's not always necessarily the quantity, but the quality. We haven't had major problems. We have an oil and gas industry that's been very, very responsible. Many of the drillers, the explorers, are from northern Michigan. This is where they've chosen to live, where they've raised their families, their grandchildren, etc. So I think, we need to continue to take prudent steps, be very mindful of what the new technologies are, how they impact our environment, and I think Michigan DEQ has been very responsive to that. We have some great technological universities here, whether it's Michigan Tech, U of M, Michigan State, and many other schools monitoring scientifically what's going on. So I feel very comfortable with what's going on. I agreed with Governor Engler when he chose that we wouldn't do drilling under or in the Great Lakes. I agree with that. So, we're looking at we passed legislation to use existing wells, to go back and tap into those, to see if we can get further, with carbon sequestration, can we get more oil out of them? Can we get more natural gas? So I think we've done a very good job, and I commend both our regulators and the industry for doing a good job in protecting Michigan.
Would you support regulations requiring disclosure of what chemicals are used?
Well,
I
I think many of those are already in place. I think there are certain proprietary pieces that aren't made public, but I think that they are disclosed to the DEQ. But I don't think that we're using anything that's not already being used elsewhere. One of the things that when I was doing a little traveling last summer with my family, and I was reading in some of the Canadian papers in Ontario, some of the technologies to reuse some of the waters. It's when you look at the total amount of water used in many of these issues as compared to the cities and such, it's not that much, but I think we should make use of reuse it if we can. And so I think as technology improves, we could continue to see good oil and natural gas exploration in Michigan without some of the other downsides that potentially could exist.
Well, the question was, would you support the disclosure of those chemicals being used for hydraulic fracturing to the public?
I think I would support the disclosure to the point that if for some reason something were to happen, that those parties that would have to respond to it, whether it's some type of cleanup, anything like that, that's the level. I certainly want to protect the proprietary chemicals. I certainly don't want to disrupt the competition there, but to make sure that the regulators are aware of what.
So then you do not support the disclosure of those chemicals to the public?
I support disclosure to the point to the public itself that makes sense, but more importantly to the regulating agencies and to any groups that have a interest that need, I don't want to say on a need-to-know basis, but what they're looking at, protecting the companies, their proprietary information, but still balancing that with the public interest of making sure that they aren't, if there's a cleanup or any type of chemicals that are found not to be good. If a company comes out or a research group out of a university says XYZ chemical is bad, well then they would let the DEQ know, and then the DEQ, if that's one of those proprietary ones, could still go back to that company and say, we're not going to allow this anymore. But that doesn't necessarily need to be, whether it's out there or not.
What about the Enbridge oil pipeline? The Attorney General and the DEQ created, as I understand, a task force to study the issue. Yeah, your opponent says they should be doing much more.
Well, again, the Straits, the Great Lakes, again, growing up 2 blocks from West Bay, spending my whole life there practically, very important, and I take that very, very seriously. That's why I appreciated the exercises they were conducting with the Coast Guard, the DEQ, again, bringing those groups together to protect the Great Lakes. Very critical. I support the DEQ director. I support the Attorney General in their efforts to do that. I've spoken to our congressional delegation, Congressman Benishek, Congressman Camp, people like that, saying we need to continue to monitor and be very, very aware of what's going on. But ultimately, that is a federal issue. And so we at the state should be on top of it. We should be coordinating with our federal partners to make sure that there aren't problems there, that they are inspecting the pipeline regularly and updating us, but that ultimately is a federal issue. And, you know, as a state legislator, I can't regulate it. I'm unsure of what else I can do as a state legislator other than to make sure that DEQ and all of us are telling our congressional delegation and the federal government, hey, this is important to us. Much like with the Asian carp issue, the same thing. You know, that is an issue whether you close down the Chicago River, break it off. That ultimately is a federal issue. And again, I see this as a great opportunity, and it's already a bipartisan support to make sure that Congress, that the federal government, does the right thing.
Well, and as I understand it, they're putting up, they're making Enbridge comply with regulations that were already in place, which are the supports every 75 feet, I think it is, or whatever, and the distance is. But would you, what Philadelphia's calling for is a double-walled pipeline. Is that something, I know you're saying the state can't regulate that, but is that something that you'd like to see too?
If it's something that if they determine is effective and it works, I have been told, the reports that I've seen from the federal government, the EPA, those groups, that the pipeline is fine, and especially the lessons they learned after the Kalamazoo River, I think they will not ignore their warning signals. It was my understanding that they said, oh no, that warning signal wasn't correct. I think today that they would not do that. If that's proved to be effective and what we should do to protect, fine. But if people, the experts, come back who have a great deal more expertise in this area than I do, if they come back and say, no, it's XYZ thick, it's well maintained, it's working well, you don't need to do that, well then that's fine too. I'm going to rely upon the engineers, the technicians, the scientists that have, you know, monitor and develop these pipelines.
Another environmental issue, Philadelphia, living up in Sault Ste. Marie, says he looks over to Canada and sees wind turbines, solar arrays. Michigan's met its self-imposed alternative energy.
Yeah, we're coming up on it pretty closely
Okay.
here, based off of PA 295.
Do you support extending that, expanding it?
We're looking at that currently. Right now, I just had conversations with a number of different interest groups, whether it's utilities, some of the environmental groups. Also I've met with Senator Mike Knopf, who chairs the Senate Energy and Technology Committee. I've talked to Eric Nesbitt, who chairs the Energy and Tech Committee in the House. I think PA 295 has been very successful, especially in the area of research and development and finding out what works, what doesn't, and getting our utilities both investor-owned, which would be the DTEs and the Consumers Energy, co-ops, which we have several co-ops up here, whether it's Cloverland up in the UP or maybe Cherryland, Roller Wolverine, or in Northern Lower, and also the municipal utilities. And in my current House district, I have all three, the IOUs, the co-ops, and public power, and have moved in the right direction on that. I personally believe in conservation and have supported many pieces of legislation, both as a co-sponsor and a sponsor of those bills, that anytime that we get new technologies, LED bulbs are a great example of how the market is moving towards that, not completely mandated. I think, again, early on for certain technologies, I think we need to put some incentives in place, and again, that's why I supported the PA 295 of 2007. It was before I got there as a legislator. Was it 2008? It was before I got there as a state rep. But I supported it. I thought the 10% renewable was an appropriate level. Now we have the technologies in place. We're seeing what works, what doesn't work, plus all the other incentives to, whether it's to winterize or weatherize your house, those type of things. Now we're going to go back and look at what we're going to do.
Well, you guys talk about jobs and the economy all the time. Couldn't, if you created this market here with a larger goal in, in some sort of reasonable time frame in the future, but couldn't you, then you'd get, the governor talks about career tech programs in the schools. Couldn't you just you could create a whole new, or a much larger industry?
And that started already, and we've already seen that. And I think that the incentives themselves, the ability to save money by cutting back on your energy use, has already started to spur that. Not just the mandate of the 10% by 2015, but just the improvements in technology. I look at, in my own home, starting to use, I've used some of the LED bulbs in certain lights. My wife still likes her incandescent when she's sitting and reading. But for other lights that we don't use as often, or if it's more of a night light overnight or something, we've moved there and are excited about the LED bulbs. I think part of the problem with mandating it just being that those technologies and such be developed just in Michigan, what happens when we have technologies and other states say, nope, we've got to do our own. So what I've been looking at is, should we get credit for renewables if they get hydropower from Wisconsin or Ontario? Should that count as part of the renewable portfolio standard? Does it count, and I was meeting with one of my electric co-ops, they get no credit. If they take some of their monies and rehab a house, put in new windows, better insulation, that drives down somebody's natural gas or propane use. Now they're an electric utility, they don't get credit for that. As they were saying, we're handing out LED bulbs, we get credit for that, we have no idea if people are using them or not. But should we get credit for helping that? So I think what we're looking at, and what I would be more inclined to support, is a more all-inclusive, that if a utility helps offset costs by helping someone finance windows, they should get some credit for that. Might not cut down electric use, but it could cut down natural gas use.
Well, you mentioned California and also this 20 or 10% by 2015. I know you said California being the opinion of some are of the opinion of being overregulated there, but the difference between what they've got there and what we have, certainly Michigan's is not an aggressive goal.
No, but California is a completely different state too. Cost of living is significantly higher. There's a lot of other factors in there. But again, I go back to a more balanced approach. I think we're doing the right things in Michigan. One of the reasons why I continue to look at it and discuss it, and I'm not opposed to any of it. Like I said, I supported the 10% by 2015. There are a lot of people in my party et cetera, that would have done none of that. So again, it's a balanced approach. It is looking at, for municipalities, capturing methane off of their wastewater treatment plants. And they, are those credits, can they be sold in the market? We need to look at also consistency in making sure that if people make those kind of investments, municipalities, power companies, that they can get a return on their investment, not just the environmental side, which is important. And I think Michigan's made huge strides since the late 60s, early 70s. I'm old enough to remember that where my parents grew up in Cleveland, the Cuyahoga burning. I wasn't there, I was in New York City, but nonetheless, I can remember that. I think we've made tremendous strides, and so we need to continue to do that, but it needs to be in a balanced approach. But I'm not opposed to looking at any of that, and I have been supportive of initiatives like that. But for a family moving up here, or a business, they want to make sure when they're attracting employees, they want to make sure that there are good schools nearby. And I think having those critical elementary schools and middle schools, junior highs, are even more important for the survival of the community than having, I think, a mascot and trying to prop up a high school that may or may not have the enrollment. Whereas if you can attract families because you have a good elementary school and a good middle school nearby, that's part of it. And again, it's no easy answer. I've been very supportive of school funding equity. My mom was a public school teacher and was one of the founders of Citizens for Equity here in northern Michigan. So we made great strides to that. Give kudos to Senator Howard Walker. We've protected declining enrollment monies. Again, some of these schools, it's a question of reestablishing what the base is. We saw the tough things they had to do in Sheboygan, the tough things they had to do in Charlevoix, closing down some elementary schools, but they've gotten back on track. They said, okay, they've regrouped, and this is where we're going to put our monies in, this is what we're going to invest in, and again, those key neighborhood schools and going with one high school, and that could help put them back on track.
What about the disparity in per pupil funding levels? Is there, I guess first, there seems to be some misconception about what Proposal A was actually going to be able to do. As I understand, there are funds generated locally that have to return back to those districts. This is coming from a conversation with Howard Walker. So you're never going to see that,
Never 100%,
okay,
but you'll get closer. The expenses in Detroit are significantly more than in Traverse City or other places in northern Michigan. But if you close the gap, and there's going to be other federal funding that comes in for those districts that have unique situations. It can be socioeconomic, unfortunately monies for school violence protection, things like that. Things I hope we don't have to take advantage of here in northern Michigan. But you'll have that. But as long as we're closing the gap closer, thousands and thousands of dollars difference, that's not right. But if we can get $500 to $1,000 difference, that's much more equitable.
Well, Proposal A was 20 years ago, and
And we've continued to close the gap. It wasn't fast enough, but when you look at the school districts at the beginning of Proposal A, specifically at Kingsley or Calcasta, which prompted that whole debate, they've made huge strides. The top funded districts obviously have not moved as quickly. We also have to look at why Proposal A, one, equity in funding for our schools, but two, if you are an older person, a retiree, or even families, housing taxes back then, property taxes, they were doubling in some of the, across the state. And if you live, gosh forbid you live on the water, you didn't even have to have an expensive home, but if you lived on water, it was tripling sometimes in a year. Mm-hmm. And so retirees were losing their homes. Even with the circuit breakers that we had to protect, they were losing their homes. They couldn't afford to live there anymore. So it had two good effects: keeping people in their homes, not taxing them out of it, and then also the funding equity piece.
Another issue that comes up a lot with the minimum wage and the wolf hunting votes. Twice this year, the legislature has preempted ballot initiatives.
Well, on the wolf hunting, I'm going to interject. That was a citizen initiative. So the citizens, which actually to get that bill to move forward, and it didn't deal with specifically wolves, it dealt with all species to let the NRC decide. That actually took more signatures to get that to the legislature, and we have the choice: do we implement it or do we put it to the ballot? And so I voted because of that citizen-based initiative to vote for it. The other one, they didn't end up having the signatures.
But you have used the citizen initiative a few times now to circumvent ballot drives.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And the question that he's getting at is, what do you think about this process? Is this process fair? Does this process need to change?
I think the process is fair and it works.
Why?
Because the citizens can initiate it, they can develop the laws, and also as a legislator, I feel that's my job, is to vote on issues. That's why, if you want to go back to the transportation funding, ultimately, whether I vote to increase taxes or decrease taxes, increase registration fees, decrease registration fees, I believe I'm elected by the people to make those decisions. I could put everything back onto the ballot, but I don't think that's why I'm elected.
But how is it fair that a fraction of the citizens, which is all that's required to get these citizens initiatives to the legislature, how is that fair that would go to the legislature and the legislature can make that a law without it being signed by the governor? It sounds like there's some checks and balances there being skipped. a fraction of citizens are making laws that the legislature is passing without the checks and balances of government.
Well, we can go back and they can appeal that law too. They can get signatures to do it. It's the same thing though. It's the same argument that if we interject an actual species, wolves in this case, why is it a handful of people in southeastern Michigan are going to tell the Upper Peninsula what they can do? Just because they think that, and again, these, it's emotional, but, wolves are touchy-feely.
But you're not getting the point here. The point here is not so much the citizens' initiative, it's that the legislature has the choice of whether or not to make that a law or make it go to the ballot. Why not just let it go to the ballot and let the citizens decide on those citizens' initiatives, rather than the legislature deciding that needs to be a law without it being signed on by the governor, and then throwing in an appropriation of about $1 million, which the legislature's done a few times, so that it can't get such an initiative. You see where the public gets a little disadvantaged by
I see
that?
what you're talking about, and in the case of the NRC and determining species, I was hearing from my constituents to vote for it, so that's why I did it. And I think it was an important issue for northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula. That's what my constituents were telling me. That's what my colleagues in the legislature from northern Michigan, what we were talking about. So that's why I voted for it. So I think
we're not talking about that. We're talking about the process. What do you think about the process? Does that process need to change, or are you happy with it?
I'm happy with it. I'm fine with it.
That's the question.
Yep. And I'm okay with it.
What about the minimum wage issue? I mean, I know that it's no secret, or you guys are saying it, that you saw 1010 or whatever the number was as a unfair number for businesses, and so you preempted that by setting up the system in the middle up to 925 or whatever in a couple years.
And then adjusted according to the rate of inflation. I think that we're using the consumer price index for that.
Why was that fair to stop that before it could get to the ballot?
I think, again, talking to the various interest groups, and when you look at northern Michigan's economy, I saw it as a very serious economic threat. Again, minimum wage, you could fall back, you could repeal it and fall back to the federal minimum wage. Many people have said, and I think there's some truth to this too, that do we really need a minimum wage? Allow the markets to do it and pay people according to what they're able to do. Those were all interesting arguments, but I thought that it was something that was important hearing from the industries that employ a lot of people here in northern Michigan. It would have had, and the Upper Peninsula, a very, very detrimental impact to those businesses. And so we felt that this was, and again, this is, I feel, my job as a legislator to decide and to vote on and take the tough votes. Whether we agree or disagree, at least you know what I'm telling you, and you can, talk to me. That this was an important step that was good for the workers. That we realized, okay, maybe we need to adjust with the time, but also protected the businesses from the standpoint of huge costs. We're already seeing it, regardless of what the minimum wage is, the automation that's going in to grocery stores, to restaurants, whether it's fast food, semi-fast food, sit down, all those technological advances are going on, whether we adjust the minimum wage or not. And my concern is that we're going to still lose jobs. And I thought that this was a healthy compromise that was good for the workers, good for the industry, good for the state to keep us on economic track. And other states have done it and have seen some successes. So it seems like a very prudent and reasonable policy.
Okay. Does anybody else?
Yeah, I got one more. Recently, we've been learning that we're going to see a cut in the federal program as far as food stamps goes. It's going to impact a lot of citizens in the state of Michigan as early as October. And
I've just begun to heard that.
Okay, well,
heard that. That's not good anyway. I've just begun to.
The reason we're learning on this that this is impacting them is because the state of Michigan opted out of the higher heating credits. Would you, as a legislator, be willing to take another look at that opt-out?
We just had a presentation on LIHEAP and MEEP, Michigan Energy Assistance Program. So I know we've been reviewing it. We did that Tuesday, looking at not just starting on November 1st, but again, and this was a discussion with the utilities too. You know, for some people, heating is everything, but for some of our more vulnerable citizens, a lot of times seniors, that heat in the summer and they need energy assistance, maybe it's to cool down their home with an air conditioner. We need to look at it year round. I am not sure of what the direct link was, but that's something I'm certainly willing to look at again, especially to make sure that as taxpayers, if we're paying this money to Washington, D.C., I want to make sure we get it back for our people. We did that, we looked at that with the Healthy Michigan reforms. And again, you know, if this is the way that the feds are playing the game or the way it's set up, then I think it's my responsibility as a legislator to make sure that my Michigan citizens are taken care of, and that as taxpayers, we make sure we get our money back. I don't need to be a donor state. We're already in transportation. I don't want it to happen in other areas. So yes, I'd certainly glad to look at that, but I wasn't quite aware that that was the direct link, but we'll go back and look at it. Always open to that.